Manila, February 1945. The city was burning, not with the fire of battle anymore, but with the slow, smoldering ash of defeat. 3 years of Japanese occupation had turned the Pearl of the Orient into rubble and mass graves. American tanks rolled through streets littered with bodies that had been there for days, bloating in the tropical heat. Filipino guerrillas emerged from the shadows, their faces hardened by years of resistance, their eyes burning with a mixture of triumph and trauma. And in the ruins of what used to be schools, hospitals, and government buildings, Allied forces discovered something unexpected. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war, many of them women, nurses, secretaries, officers' wives, civilians who had worked for the Imperial Army. They were starving, sick, and terrified. They knew what happened to prisoners in this war. They had seen it themselves during the occupation, the executions, the torture, the disappearances. What they didn't know was that their suffering was far from over. Because before they would be transported to official POW camps like Los Baños, Leyte, and Santo Tomas, they would undergo a procedure the Americans called decontamination. A medical necessity, they said, a public health measure to prevent the spread of typhus, dysentery, and cholera. But for these women, it would become something else entirely. A ritual of humiliation, a symbolic breaking. A moment when the war stopped being about nations and ideologies and became deeply, brutally personal. A moment when they would understand that defeat is not just about losing territory or surrendering weapons. It's about losing yourself. Emiko Hayashi had been a nurse with the Imperial Army for 6 years. She had joined in 1939, when the war in China was already years old and the military needed medical personnel desperately. She had been 22 then, fresh out of nursing school in Osaka, idealistic and determined to serve her country. Her father had been a doctor. Her mother had taught her that service was the highest calling. She believed in duty, in sacrifice, in the idea that her work could save lives even in the midst of death. She had treated soldiers in Shanghai, in Malaya, and finally in Manila. She had seen wounds that defied description, heard screams that never left her mind, and held the hands of dying men who called for their mothers in their final breaths. She had amputated limbs without anesthesia. She had watched boys bleed out on operating tables because there wasn't enough plasma. She had written letters to families she knew would never receive them. She thought she had seen the worst of war. She thought she understood suffering. She was wrong. When the Americans found her hiding in the basement of a destroyed hospital with 14 other women, she expected execution. That's what the propaganda had told them. Americans are savages. They will torture you. They will defile you. Death is preferable to capture. Some of the women had cyanide capsules. Emiko didn't. She had seen too much death to choose it willingly. But the soldiers who found them didn't shoot. They shouted commands in English, their voices sharp and impatient, their gestures aggressive but not violent. They didn't raise their rifles. They didn't strike anyone. Instead, they were herded into trucks like livestock, packed tightly, shoulder to shoulder, the smell of unwashed bodies and fear thick in the confined space. Driven through the devastated streets of Manila. Emiko kept her eyes down. She had been trained to endure, to remain composed, to embody the Yamato Nadeshiko, the idealized Japanese woman, graceful, obedient, resilient, silent in suffering. But as the truck passed through neighborhoods she once knew, now reduced to skeletal frames and charred wood, she felt something crack inside her. This wasn't just defeat. This was erasure. This was the end of everything she had believed in. The truck stopped at a large compound that used to be a school. Emiko recognized it. She had walked past it before the war, had seen children playing in the courtyard. Now barbed wire surrounded it. Armed guards stood at every corner, their faces blank and professional. Emiko and the others were unloaded and pushed into a courtyard. The ground was concrete, cracked and stained. There were dozens of other Japanese women already there. Some sat in silence, their arms wrapped around their knees. Others wept quietly, their shoulders shaking. A few stared blankly ahead, their minds already gone, retreated to some internal place where the war couldn't reach them. Emiko counted them. 60, maybe 70, all women, all Japanese, all defeated. She wondered how many of them had been nurses like her, how many had been soldiers' wives, how many had been caught in a war they never wanted. She wondered if it mattered, if any of it mattered anymore. Lieutenant Sarah Chen watched from a distance. She was a medic, Filipino-American, born in San Francisco but raised hearing stories of her mother's homeland. Stories of Manila before the war, stories of beauty and warmth, of markets filled with mangoes and sampaguita flowers, of family gatherings that lasted all day, stories that ended abruptly in December 1941 when Japan invaded. Her mother's family had been killed in the early days of the occupation. Her uncle executed for hiding resistance fighters. Her grandmother shot in the street for not bowing quickly enough to a Japanese patrol. Sarah had volunteered for the army the day after she heard. She was 20 years old. She wanted justice. She wanted revenge. She wanted to make them pay. But standing here, looking at these women, skeletal and hollow-eyed, their clothes hanging off their bodies like rags, she felt something unexpected. Doubt. These weren't the monsters from the propaganda posters. These weren't the brutal occupiers who had terrorized her mother's homeland. These were just women, starving, terrified, defeated, and she didn't know what to do with that. Her commanding officer, Major Thompson, approached. He was a tall man with a face like carved stone, a career officer who had fought in North Africa before being transferred to the Pacific. He handed her a clipboard. "Lieutenant Chen, you'll oversee the decontamination process. Medical protocol. We've got reports of typhus, dysentery, cholera. We can't risk an outbreak spreading to our troops or into the civilian population. We've already lost too many men to disease in this theater." Sarah nodded. "Understood, sir. What's the procedure?" "Standard sanitation. Strip them down. High-pressure wash with disinfectant solution. Delousing powder, then full medical inspection. Document any signs of communicable disease. Anyone symptomatic gets quarantined immediately." Sarah hesitated. The words hung in the air. Strip them down. High-pressure wash. She had read the manual, she knew the protocols, but reading words on a page was different from standing here, looking at real people. "High-pressure wash, sir? With what equipment?" "Fire hoses. It's the fastest way, most efficient. We've got hundreds to process and limited time. Transport trucks are scheduled for tomorrow." He looked at her directly, his eyes hard. "Is there a problem, Lieutenant?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say this feels wrong. She wanted to say there has to be another way, but she was a soldier. She had orders, and she had learned a long time ago that questioning orders led nowhere. "No, sir, no problem." Major Thompson nodded. "Good. I need this done by 1800 hours. Report any complications directly to me." He walked away, already moving on to the next task, the next problem to solve. Sarah stood there, clipboard in hand, and felt the weight of what she was about to oversee settle into her bones. Sergeant Frank Morrison was in charge of the sanitation team. He was 34 years old, a practical man from Pittsburgh, a plumber before the war. He understood systems, water pressure, flow rates, efficiency. When Major Thompson told him to set up decontamination stations, he didn't think twice. This was a job, a technical problem with a technical solution. Disease was the enemy now. Typhus could kill more men than bullets. Cholera could wipe out entire units. This was preventive medicine. This was smart. He had seen what happened when sanitation broke down. He had been in North Africa when dysentery tore through their camp. Men dying in agony, their bodies wasted, their dignity gone. He wasn't going to let that happen here. He directed his team to connect the fire hoses to the water mains. They set up wooden platforms where the women would stand, elevated slightly for better drainage. Drainage systems to carry away the runoff, channeled into the sewers. It was clean, organized, professional. He calculated the water pressure carefully, enough to ensure thorough cleaning but not so much that it would cause injury. He wasn't a monster. He was a technician. He didn't think about what it would feel like to stand under that pressure. He didn't think about shame or dignity or cultural taboos. He thought about gallons per minute. He thought about efficiency. He thought about getting the job done. When everything was ready, he reported to Major Thompson. "Decontamination stations operational, sir. We can process approximately 20 subjects every 30 minutes. Good. Begin processing immediately." Morrison nodded and walked back to his station. He lit a cigarette, checked the pressure gauges one more time, and waited for the first group. Just another job, just another day in the war. Emiko was in the second group called forward. She and 19 other women were led into a large open area. Concrete floor still wet from the first group, walls on 3 sides, open to the sky, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. There were hoses mounted on stands, thick rubber hoses like the ones used to fight fires, soldiers standing behind them, their faces impassive. And in the corner, Lieutenant Sarah Chen with a medical bag and a face that revealed nothing. A voice barked orders in English, sharp, commanding. Emiko didn't understand all the words, but the gestures were unmistakable. "Remove your clothing, everything, now!" She felt her breath stop. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Around her, the other women froze. Time seemed to slow down. One of them, Yuki Ishikawa, the wife of a colonel, spoke in Japanese. Her voice was shaking but defiant. "They can't be serious. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. We have rights. We are prisoners of war, not criminals." Another woman, younger, maybe 20, began to cry. Her voice was high and panicked. I can't do this. Please, please don't make us do this." The soldiers repeated the command. Louder now, more aggressive. One of them stepped forward and mimed the action of removing a shirt, pulling at his own uniform to demonstrate. Still, the women didn't move. They couldn't. In their culture, in their upbringing, in everything they had been taught about honor and modesty and what it meant to be a woman, this was unthinkable. Nudity was private, sacred. To be exposed like this in front of strangers, in front of men, was a violation worse than violence. This was worse than death. This was the destruction of self. Private Eduardo Santos stood near the entrance, assigned to perimeter security. He was 22 years old, a guerrilla fighter who had been integrated into the U.S. forces only weeks ago. He had fought the Japanese for 3 years. He had lived in the jungle, survived on routes and whatever they could steal, ambushed patrols, sabotaged supply lines. He had seen his village burned to the ground, his sister killed, his father executed in the town square, shot in the head in front of everyone as a warning. He hated the Japanese. He had dreamed of this moment, the moment when they would be defeated, humiliated, broken. He had imagined it would feel like justice, like closure, like the end of something terrible, but watching these women, terrified and shaking, their eyes wide with fear, he felt something twist in his stomach, something that felt wrong. This wasn't victory. This wasn't justice. This was something else, something that made him feel sick. One of the American soldiers, impatient with the delay, stepped forward and grabbed the collar of an older woman's shirt. He didn't rip it. He just tugged. A warning, a threat. The woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing, her hands covering her face, and that's when Emiko made her decision. She stepped forward. She looked at the soldier, meeting his eyes for just a moment, and slowly, with trembling hands that she fought to keep steady, she began to unbutton her nurse's uniform. If someone had to go first, it would be her. She would spare the others that shame, that first terrible moment. She had been a nurse. She had seen bodies. She had touched wounds. She could do this. She could endure this. The uniform fell to the ground, stained and worn. Then the undershirt, gray with age and sweat. Then everything else, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. She stood naked in the February heat, her body thin and marked by years of war. Scars from shrapnel, bruises that had never fully healed, ribs visible under pale skin. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't look at the soldiers. She didn't look at the other women. She didn't look at anything. She focused on breathing, in and out, in and out. And in that moment, she disappeared inside herself. She went somewhere deep, somewhere the world couldn't reach, somewhere safe. The other women followed, some quickly, wanting it over with, their movements jerky and desperate. Others slowly, each piece of clothing a small death, a small surrender. Yuki Ishikawa was the last. She stood trembling, her hands clutching her blouse so tightly her knuckles were white, tears streaming down her face. She had been the wife of a colonel. She had attended formal dinners with generals. She had been respected, honored. She had servants. She had status. And now she was here, exposed, erased, reduced to nothing. When she finally undressed, her movements were mechanical, disconnected, as if her body was doing something her mind refused to accept. She covered her face with her hands and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Sergeant Morrison turned on the hoses. The water hit them like a physical blow. High pressure. Cold, despite the tropical heat. It knocked some of them off balance, sent them stumbling. They gasped and cried out. The force of it stung their skin, already fragile from malnutrition and disease. Morrison watched the pressure gauge and adjusted it slightly. He wasn't trying to hurt them. He was just doing his job, making sure they were clean, making sure the disease didn't spread. But the women didn't know that. To them, this was punishment. This was revenge. This was the war made personal. This was what defeat felt like. The water pounded them for 5 minutes, then 10. It felt like hours. Soap was thrown at their feet, harsh military soap that burned their eyes. They were ordered to scrub. Some did, their movements slow and clumsy. Others just stood there, letting the water wash over them, their minds somewhere far away. Somewhere this wasn't happening. Lieutenant Sarah Chen watched from the side. Her clipboard hung limp in her hand. She had stopped taking notes. She was supposed to be looking for signs of disease, checking for lice, documenting symptoms, rashes, lesions, swelling. But all she could see were the faces, the way they looked at nothing, the way they seemed to fold in on themselves, to become smaller, to disappear. One of the women, barely 19, with short black hair and a birthmark on her shoulder, looked directly at her. Her eyes were empty, completely empty, as if everything that made her a person had been washed away with the soap. Sarah looked away. She hated herself for it, but she looked away. She couldn't hold that gaze. She couldn't face what she saw there. When the washing was finished, the women were handed rough towels, military issue, and plain cotton shifts. They dressed quickly, desperately, their hands shaking so badly some of them could barely manage the buttons. But the damage was done. Something inside them had been stripped away, and it wasn't coming back. Emiko pulled the shift over her head and stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just breathed. In and out. In and out. She told herself she was still alive. That was something. That had to be something. That had to mean something. But she wasn't sure she believed it. Private Eduardo Santos couldn't stop thinking about his sister. Her name had been Maria. She had been 16 when the Japanese soldiers came to their village. He didn't know what they did to her before they killed her. He had tried not to imagine. He had tried to bury that question so deep it would never surface. But now, watching these women, he imagined anyway. He imagined his sister standing where they stood. He imagined her shame, her fear, her helplessness. And he realized something that made him feel sick to his stomach. Humiliation was humiliation. Suffering was suffering. Pain was pain. It didn't matter what flag you fought under. It didn't matter what uniform you wore. It didn't matter which side of history you ended up on. These women were someone's daughters, someone's sisters, someone's mothers, and what was being done to them, no matter how justified, no matter how necessary, was still a kind of violence. He turned and walked away. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to figure out how to live with what he had just seen, how to reconcile the hatred he had carried for 3 years with the humanity he couldn't deny anymore. Over the following days, hundreds of Japanese women went through the same process, 247, according to the official records. It was documented in U.S. Army medical reports as a standard sanitation procedure, necessary to prevent disease outbreaks, efficient in processing large numbers of POWs, successful in identifying and isolating symptomatic individuals. The reports were clinical, detailed, professional. They noted water pressure levels, disinfectant concentrations, processing times. They noted 12 cases of typhus identified and quarantined, 8 cases of dysentery, 3 cases of tuberculosis. The procedures were deemed effective. The mission was accomplished. But for the women who endured it, it was something else entirely. It was the moment they understood that the war was over, that they had lost, that their bodies, their dignity, their sense of self no longer belonged to them, that they were no longer people but problems, no longer individuals but threats, no longer women but contaminants to be cleaned. Some of them would later describe it in diaries recovered after the war. Some would speak of it in interviews with the International Red Cross decades later, their voices still shaking, their hands still trembling. They would say it was worse than the bombings, worse than the hunger, worse than the fear of death, because this was a different kind of violence, a violence that didn't kill the body but destroyed the soul, a violence that left you alive but took away the part of you that made life worth living. Years later, Emiko Hayashi would return to Japan on a repatriation ship in 1946. She would rebuild her life piece by piece, day by day. She would become a nurse again, working in a small clinic in Kyoto, treating children and elderly patients. She would marry a quiet man who had also served in the war, who also carried scars he never spoke about. They understood each other's silences. She would have 2 children. She would cook and clean and laugh and live. She would grow old. She would watch her children have children. She would live a full life, but she would never speak of Manila. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to anyone. Because some wounds don't heal. They just become part of who you are. They just become the foundation on which you build everything else. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would remember the cold water, the concrete under her feet, the eyes watching, and she would remind herself that she survived, that she endured, that she was still here. And that had to be enough. Lieutenant Sarah Chen would leave the Army in 1946. She would go to medical school on the GI Bill. She would become a doctor, specializing in pediatrics. She would spend her career working in underserved communities, treating children who couldn't afford care, fighting for public health programs, advocating for the vulnerable. She never spoke of Manila either, but sometimes late at night when she was alone, she would see that girl's face, 19 years old, empty eyes, looking at her, and she would wonder if she had done the right thing, if following orders was ever enough, if being a good soldier meant being a good person. She never found an answer. She just kept working, kept trying to heal, kept trying to balance the scales. Sergeant Frank Morrison would go back to Pittsburgh after the war. He would go back to being a plumber. He would marry his high school sweetheart. He would have 3 kids. He would coach Little League. He would tell people he served in the Pacific, that he helped liberate Manila, that he did his part. He never mentioned the hoses. He never thought about it much. To him, it had just been a job, just a task that needed doing, just another day in the war. He slept fine at night. Private Eduardo Santos would spend the rest of his life working for veterans' rights in the Philippines. He would fight to get Filipino soldiers recognized by the U.S. government, compensated for their service, honored for their sacrifice. It would take decades. Most of the men he fought alongside would die before they received anything. But he kept fighting. And he would tell anyone who would listen that war doesn't end when the shooting stops, that the worst violence is often the quietest, that history remembers battles but forgets the people broken in between, that we measure victory in territory gained and enemies defeated, but we never count the cost in dignity lost, in souls broken, in the quiet violence that happens in the aftermath. The decontamination procedures in Manila were never classified. They were never hidden. They were written into official reports, filed away in military archives, and forgotten. Because they were legal. They were justified by medical necessity. They were approved by commanding officers. They followed established protocols. But legality and morality are not the same thing. And just because something is written down, just because it's official, doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's humane, doesn't mean we should forget it. The women who were hosed down in Manila carried that moment with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it, in quiet voices, to researchers and historians who asked. Most didn't. Most buried it so deep that even they tried to forget. But they all remembered. They remembered the cold, the pressure, the eyes watching, the feeling of being reduced to something less than human. The moment when they stopped being people and became problems to be solved. History calls it decontamination, a neutral word, a technical word, a word that makes it sound reasonable, necessary, justified. They called it something else. They called it the day they learned that even in defeat, there are deeper ways to fall. They called it the day they understood that war doesn't just destroy bodies, it destroys everything. This is not a story about heroes or villains. It's a story about what happens when systems replace humanity, when efficiency becomes cruelty, when we stop seeing people and start seeing categories, threats, problems, when we forget that the person on the other side of the war, the person wearing the enemy's uniform, is still a person, still someone's daughter, still someone who feels shame and fear and pain. Manila was liberated in February 1945. The city was freed from 3 years of brutal occupation. That liberation saved countless lives. That liberation was necessary. That liberation was just. But for the women who stood under those hoses, liberation looked a lot like destruction. And the scars they carried were not from bullets or bombs or shrapnel. They were from water, from soap, from the unbearable weight of being seen and erased at the same time. War is not just what we do to each other on the battlefield. It's what we do in the aftermath. In the procedures, in the protocols, in the camps and the processing centers, and the bureaucratic machinery that turns people into paperwork. In the moments when we stop seeing faces and start seeing numbers. When we stop asking if something is right and only ask if it's efficient. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part of all. Because the violence of war is obvious. We expect it. We prepare for it. But the violence that comes wrapped in procedure, justified by necessity, approved by authority, that violence is invisible. That violence is silent. That violence is the kind we forget. The kind we file away. The kind we tell ourselves was necessary. And maybe it was. Maybe there was no other way. Maybe in the chaos of war, with disease spreading and resources limited and time running out, maybe this was the only option. But that doesn't mean it wasn't violence. That doesn't mean it didn't leave scars. That doesn't mean we should forget. These women deserve to be remembered, not as enemies, not as statistics, but as people, as human beings who suffered, who endured, who survived, who carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. Their stories matter. Their pain matters. And we must never forget that even in the pursuit of victory, even in the name of necessity, we are still responsible for the humanity we destroy. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories from World War II. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this difficult chapter of history. These stories matter. These voices matter. And we must never forget what war does to the people caught in its machinery. Thank you for watching.